Well, hi everyone. It's Mrs. Highsung again, and it's time for our reading in Lassie Come Home. Today we will be reading chapter 17, and it is Thursday, April the 23rd. Now, you've just finished reading some chapters where Lassie has gone through more dangerous adventures. She's had to swim another river, and she's had some run-ins and some conflicts with some dog catchers. But with her perseverance and her persistence, she has gotten away again. Chapter 17, Lassie comes over the border. Slowly, steadily, Lassie came across a field. She was not trotting now. She was going at a painful walk. Her head was low and her tail hung lifelessly. Her thin body moved from side to side as though it took the effort of her entire frame to make her legs continue to function. But her course was straight. She was still continuing to go south. Across the meadow she came in her tired walk. She paid no attention to the cattle that grazed on the green about her and that lifted their heads from their feeding to regard her as she passed. The grass grew thicker and coarser as she followed the path. The track became beaten mud. Then the mud was a puddle of water, and the puddle was the edge of a river. She stood at the trampled place. It was where the cattle came to drink and to stand for coolness in the heat of the day. Beyond her, some of them stood now knee-deep in the slow backwater. They turned and regarded her, their jaws moving unceasingly. Lassie whimpered slightly and lifted her head as if to catch some scent from far bank. She rocked on her feet for a moment, then, wading forward tentatively, she went deeper and deeper. Her feet now felt no bottom. The backwater began to carry her upstream. She began swimming, her tail swirling out behind her. This was not a turbulent river like the one back in the highlands. It was not a dirty, factory-clustered one like that, now many miles back in the industrial city. But it was broad, and its current went firmly, carrying Lassie downstream. Her tired legs drove with the beat, her forefeet pumped steadily. The south bank moved past her, but she seemed to be getting no nearer. Weakness numbed her, and her beat grew slower. Her outstretched head came under the water. As if this wakened her from sleep, she began threshing wildly. Her head went straight up, and her forefeet sent a splashing foam before her. She was a swimmer in panic. But her head cleared again, and once more she settled down to the steady drive forward. It was a long swim, a courageous swim. And when at last she reached the other shore, she was almost too weak to climb the bank. At the first place, her forepaws scratched, and she fell back. The bank was too high. The backwater began carrying her upstream. Lassie tried again. She splashed and fell back again. Then the eddy carried her, and at last her feet touched a shelving bottom. She waded to shore. As though the weight of the water in her coat were an extra load that was too much for her to carry, she staggered. Then, dragging herself rather than walking, she crawled up the bank, and there at last she dropped. She could go no farther. But she was in England. Lassie did not know that. She was only a dog going home, not a human being wise in the manner of maps. She could not know that she had made her way all down through the highlands, the lowlands, that the river she had crossed was the Tweed, which divides England and Scotland. All these things she did not know. All she knew was that as she crawled higher on the bank, a strange thing happened. Her legs would no longer respond properly, and as she was urging herself forward, the tired muscles rebelled at last. She sank, plunged a moment, and then fell on her side. For a second she whined. With her forepaws she clawed the earth, still dragging herself south. She was in rough grass now. She pulled herself along, a yard, another foot, another few inches. Then at last the muscles stopped their work. Lassie lay on one side, her legs outstretched in dead dog position. Her eyes were glazed. The only movement was a spasmodic lifting and falling of the pinched flanks. All that day Lassie lay there. The flies buzzed about her, but she did not lift her head to snap at them. Evening came, and across the river was the sound of the herder and the lowing of the cows. The last notes of the birds came, the singing of a thrush through the lingering twilight. Darkness came with its night sounds, the scream of an owl and the stealthy rippling of a hunting otter, the faraway bark of a farm dog, and the whispering in the trees. Dawn came with new sounds, the splash of a leaping trout while the river was still veiled in mist. Then the rooks rose with their eternal cry of warning as a man left the door of the farm cottage over the fields. The sun came and the shadows danced weakly on the grass as the overhead trees shimmered in the first breeze of the new day. As the sun reached her, Lassie rose slowly. Her eyes were dull. Walking slowly, she set out, away from the river, going south. The room was small and humble. In a chair beside a table where the lamp glowed, Daniel Fadden sat, reading slowly from the newspaper. Nearer the coal fire on the hearth, his wife sat in a rocking chair, knitting. She teetered endlessly back and forth as her fingers flashed over the wool and needles, so that the movements all seemed related. One rock of the chair, 3 stitches on the needles. They were both old people, and it seemed that they had been so long together in life that there was no longer any need to talk. They were contented just to be sure in the knowledge the other was near. Finally, the man pushed his steel-rimmed spectacles back on his forehead and looked at the hearth. "We'll do with a bit more coal on the fire," he said. His wife nodded as she rocked, and her lips went through the noiseless form of counting. She was turning a heel in her knitting and wanted to keep sure count. The man rose slowly. Taking the scuttle, he went to the sink. In the cupboard beneath was the coal bin. With a little shovel, he slowly scooped some out. "We're nearly out," he said. His wife looked over. Mentally, both of them began to count the cost of more coal. How quickly they had used this last hundredweight. Their lives were deeply concerned with these things. Expenses ran very close, and all they had was the small pension that the government paid for their son who had been killed in France. Then each of them drew the old age pension of 10 shillings a week given by the state. This was no wealth, but they husbanded it carefully and owed no man. Husbanded means they took care of it carefully. The tiny cottage far out on the highway from any town was a cheap place to live. In the little plot of land about it, Fadden grew a stock of vegetables. He had a flock of chickens, several ducks, and a goose fattening for Christmas. This last was their largest and most lasting joke. 6 years before, Fadden had traded a dozen early hen eggs for one tiny gosling. Carefully he had raised it, boasting about what a fine, plump bird it would be by Christmas time. It had become just that, marvelous and plump. In a few days before the holiday of holidays, Fadden had taken his hatchet, and he had sat indoors a long time regarding it. Finally, his wife, understanding, had looked up patiently. "Dan," she said, "I just don't think I'd favor goose this year. If you did a chicken instead, and—" "Aye, Dally," Fadden had said, "it would be a terrible waste. One big goose for just the 2 on us. Now, a chicken would be just right." And so the goose was spared. Each year after that, it was dutifully fattened for Christmas. "This year it goes," Fadden would always announce, "fattening a goose all year, just to strut and waddle round like he's king of everything. This year he goes." And always the goose lived. His wife always knew it would. When Fadden announced belligerently that it was headed for the Yule oven, she would say dutifully, "Aye, Dan." And when he hemmed and hawed at the last minute and announced that a goose was much too big for the 2 of them, she would say, "Aye, Dan." Privately, she often said to herself that the goose would be living long after, as she put it, the 2 of them were deep under the ground and at rest. But she would not have it otherwise. In fact, if Don had ever gone through with his firmly announced intentions, she would have felt the world was dropping from under her. Of course, it cost a lot to feed up a great hungry goose, but one could save other ways. A penny here, a penny there. One could always buy carefully and save carefully, nursing the copper coins along. So their life went with dignity and great content, but always with the thought of precious pennies, as it was this evening, when they both reckoned up the amount of coal and how long it had lasted. Never mind mending the fire, Dan," she said. "Just bed it up with ashes, and we'll away to bed. We stay up too late anyhow." "Sit ye there a while," Daniel said, for he knew Dally dearly loved to rock and knit before the hearth for a couple of hours in the evening. "It's early yet. I'll put just a little on. For heaven knows it's chilly enough tonight. Nasty, cold east rain." Dally nodded. As she rocked, she listened to the wind howling at the east of the low house and the slatting of the rain on the shutters. It'll be coming up for autumn soon, Dan. Aye, that it will. This is the first of them Easters. And cold. Well, all right, throw a man's body to his bones. I'd hate to be in it long. His wife rocked steadily, and her mind wandered. Whenever anyone talked of bad weather, she always turned her mind back to young Danny. In those trenches, they had had no warm hearths. The men had lived their lives that first winter in muddy holes in the ground, sleeping there of nights with no shelter. A body would die, you would think, and yet when Danny had come home on leave, there he was, all glowing and healthy and fine. And when she'd asked him about being careful to keep his chest warm and his throat dry, he had laughed and held his sides. A big, booming, strong laugh. Aye, after living through this winter in France, it's never cold that'll carry me off, Ma, he had boomed. And it wasn't cold nor illness. Machine guns, his colonel had written in the letter that Dally still kept folded away beside her marriage license. Ah, war, machine wars, bullets took them all. The brave and the cowardly, the weak and the strong ones like Danny. And it wasn't the dying that took bravery then, for cowards could die. It was the living that took bravery, living in that mud and rain and cold, and keeping the spirit strong through it all. That was the bravery. And how often she pictured it when the winds died and blew and the cold rain slatted. All so long ago, but she still pictured it. Knitting, purling, rocking, knitting, purling, rocking. She halted her chair and sat with head erect. For a moment she was still. Then she began again, knitting, purling, rocking, thinking. Again she stopped. She held her breath to hear better, hear above the sound of the fire. There was the hiss of the coal, the spit of ashes dropping in the pit beneath the grate, the crinkle of the newspaper, farther away the tap of a shutter looser than the rest, the surging smacking of rain. Farther beyond that there was another noise, out in the deep of the wind, or was it imagination from thinking of Danny so long ago? She dropped her head, and then she sat up again. Dan, there is something by the chickens. He sat erect a moment. Ah, now, Dally, you're always imagining things, he reproved. There's not a thing but the wind, and that shutter's a bit loose. I'll have to fix it. He went back to his reading, but the little gray-haired woman sat with head erect. Then she spoke again. There is something. She rose. If you won't go see what's after your chickens, Daniel Fadden, I will. She took her shovel and her shawl, but her husband rose. Now, he grumbled. Sit you down. If you want me to go, I'll go just to make your soul content. Now I'll look around. Wrap your muffler around your neck first. Then, she reproved. She watched him go, then she was alone in the house. Her ears, attuned by the lonesomeness to the sounds of living, heard his footsteps go away, and a few moments later, above the noise of the storm, come back quickly. He was running. She jumped up and faced the door before it opened. Get your shawl and come, he said. I've found it. Where's the lantern? Together they hurried out into the night, leaning against the gusts of wind and rain. Coming up the road beside the hawthorn hedge that bordered the highway, at last, the old man paused and scrambled down the bank. His wife held up the lantern. There she saw what her husband had found, a dog lying in the ditch. She watched its head turn, and for a second the light glowed incandescent in its eyes as the lamp shone. Poor thing, she said, and who would leave their dog out in a night like this? The words were torn away by the wind, but the old man heard the sound of her voice. It's too done up to walk, he shouted. Hold the lantern up. Shall I give you a hand? Hey! She bit down and shouted, Shall I give you a hand? No, I can manage. She saw him bend and pick up the animal. Grasping the shawl against the gale that would pluck it away, she went beside him, holding the lantern high. Go easy, Dan, now, she said. Oh, poor thing. She ran ahead of him to open the door. Panting, the old man struggled in. The door slammed. The two old people brought Lassie into the warmth of the hearth and laid her on the rug. They stood back a moment, looking at her. Lassie lay, with eyes closed. I doubt it'll live till the morn, the man said. Well, that's no reason to stand there. We can at least try. Get your wet things off, quick, Dan, or I'll have you drowned. 2. Look at it. Shiver. It isn't dead. Get that sack from the bottom of the cupboard, Dan, and dry it off some. Awkwardly, the old man bent, rubbing the dog's drenched coat. She's awful mucky, Dolly, he said. Your nice clean hearthrug will be all muddied up. Then there will be a job for you shaking it out in the morning, she answered tartly. I wonder if we could feel it. The old man looked up. His wife was holding in her hand the can of condensed milk. Their unspoken thoughts went back and forth like a silent conversation. It was the last of their milk. Well, we'll have tea for breakfast without me, the woman said. Save a bit, Dolly. You don't like your tea without milk. It won't matter, she said. She began warming the milk in water. I often think we just do things from habit, Dan, she went on. They say in China now they always drink tea without milk. Happens it's because they haven't learned any better, he mumbled. He kept on rubbing the dog's cold body as his wife stirred the milk in the pan on the grate. There was silence in the cottage. Lassie lay there unmoving. In her half-consciousness and terrible weariness, a feeling of dim peace stole over her. So many things came from the past and comforted her. The place smelled right. There was the mixed aroma of coal smoke and baking bread. The hands that touched her, they did not imprison or bring pain. Instead, they soothed and brought peace to sore and aching muscles. The people, they did not move suddenly or shout noisily or throw things that hurt. They went quietly, not startling a dog. There was warmth, too. This, most of all. It was a drugging warmth, one which took the senses away and made awareness slip away as if in a gentle stream that flowed on to forgetfulness and death. Only dimly, Lassie knew of the saucer of warm milk sat beside her head. Her senses would not come back from their half-conscious state. She tried to lift her head, but it would not move. Then she felt her head being lifted. The warm milk was being spooned down her throat. She gulped once, twice, 3 times. The trickle of hotness went into her body. It finished the lulling of her senses. She lay still, and the milk now being spooned into her mouth dribbled out again and onto the rug. In the cottage, the woman rose and stood beside her husband. Do you think it's dying, Dan? It doesn't swallow any more. I don't know, Dolly. It may live the night. We've done the best we can. All we can do is just let it be. The woman stared at it. Dan, I think I'll sit up with it. Now, Dolly, you've done your best, but it might need some help, and it's such a bonny dog, Dan. Bonny. That ugly mongrel of a stray. Oh, Dan, it's the bonniest dog I ever saw. Firmly, the old woman planted herself in the rocking chair and settled herself for a night of watching. A week later, Mrs. Fadden sat in her chair. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, and the memory of the storm seemed like a dream of long ago. She looked over her glasses and beamed at Lassie lying on the rug, her ears erect. It's himself, she said aloud, and you know it, don't you? There came the footsteps of her husband, and then the door opened. You know, Dan, she knows your footsteps already, the woman said proudly. Ah, he said skeptically. She does, Dolly maintained. The other day, when that peddler came, she just raised the roof, I'll tell you. My word, she let him know someone was at home while you were in town. But she doesn't make a sound when she hears you coming, so she must know your footsteps. The man replied again. She's smart, and she's bonny, the woman said, more the dog than to the man. Isn't she bonny, Dan? Aye, that she is. And first off, you said she was ugly. Aye, but that was before. See, I just took an old comb and did her coat all pretty. They looked at Lassie, now lying with head erect in that lion-like posture that collies so often take. Her slim muzzle was held gracefully above the ruff that once again was beginning to show glossy white. Doesn't she look different? The woman asked proudly. Aye, that's it, Dolly, the man said dolefully. The woman caught his ominous tone. Well, what's the matter? Aye, Dolly, you see, that's just it. First of all, I thought she was a mongrel. But now, well, she's a fine dog. Of course she's a fine dog, the old woman said happily. All she needed was a bit of warmth and a little to eat and somebody to be kind to her. The man shook his head as if exasperated at his wife, who did not see what she was driving at. Aye, but don't you understand, Dolly? She's a fine dog, and now she's all cleaned up and getting better. You can see she's a very valuable dog. And what? Well, a valuable dog will have owners somewhere. Owners? Fine owners who'd leave a poor thing out wandering and bony and starving on a night like we took her in. Owners indeed. The man shook his head and sat in his chair heavily. He stuffed his clay pipe. No, Dally, it's no good. She's a valuable dog, and I can see it now. So don't get your heart set on her, because any day the owner might come. The woman sat, her mind worrying over this new and terrible thought. Her beautiful dog. Her dog. She stared at the fire and then for a long time at Lassie. And finally she spoke. Well then, if this has got to be taken away from us, Dan, it might as well be sooner as later. Oh, if anyone owns it, find out, will you, Dan? Go ask around. The man nodded. It's honest, he said. I'll go to town and ask around tomorrow. No, Dan, today. Go right now, for I'd never have a minute's peace nor sleep a wink till I knew. Go today and ask around everywhere, and then if she's to go, she'll go. And if nobody owns her, then we've done our duty and can rest easy. The man puffed his pipe, but the woman gave him no rest until he agreed to go that day. At noon he set out, walking slowly down the road to the town 4 miles away. Although the wilderness, the woman rocked. Sometimes she went to the door and looked down the highway. It was a long afternoon. The minutes dragged for the old woman. It was falling dusk when at last she heard the footsteps. Almost before the door opened, she began, Well? I asked all around the place, everywhere, and nobody seems to have lost her. Then she's ours? The woman beamed with joy and looked at the proud dog, still thin and pinched, but to her the perfection of canine breeding. She's ours, she repeated. We give them their chance. Now she's ours. Well, now, Dally, they might pass by chance and see her, so don't. She's ours now, the woman repeated solidly. Mentally, she was resolving that no owner should pass and ever see the dog. She would see to that. The dog should stay always beside her in the cottage. She would not have it running around loose outside for that terrible, unknown owner to see as he passed away. All right, boys and girls, that is chapter 7 in Lassie Come Home. I hope you enjoyed that reading. Have fun coming up with your big question and figuring out what the main topic of the chapter is, or chapters. Enjoy your commonplace book entry. We talked about that yesterday. Remember that is supposed to be a very special piece where you write down your very favorite things. So enjoy doing that. And I'll see you next time. I love you and I miss all of you. Bye.